This video is brought to you by Squarespace, the all-in-one website platform. More on Squarespace later in the video. Welcome back to Biographics. I'm your host, Cosmic Horror Madman Eric Malachite, and today's protagonist is none other than William III, the one and only Dutch King of Great Britain, penned by Ben Edelman. If Ben has provided his socials, they will be right alongside links to my storytelling deep dive channel Story Rant, my socials, and my books. With that said, let's get into it. The year was 1688, and the British Isles were in crisis. King James, a staunch Catholic, was determined to bring the old religion back to a country that had been Protestant for over a century, enraging his subjects. Many feared that, for the second time in 50 years, the country would be consumed by civil war. Meanwhile, across the English Channel, Prince William of Orange, the leading figure in the Dutch Republic, was staring down an increasingly aggressive King Louis XIV of France. He looked on events in Britain with alarm, knowing that he needed the manpower and resources the English possessed if he stood any chance of turning back the French tide. Something had to be done. One glorious revolution later, William and his wife Mary were crowned the only joint monarchs in British history. The ironic part is that William never wanted to be king. He hated all the pomp and ceremony that went with the crown. He didn't even like England that much, certainly much less than his native Holland. In return, his subjects found him cold and distant. Many of them distrusted him simply because he was a foreigner. To the rest of Europe, however, he was viewed as a Protestant champion, the bulwark against French aggression, and one of the last warrior kings. Prince William Henry, or Willem Hendrik in Dutch, was born on November 4th, 1650 in The Hague. He was from the moment of his birth the Prince of Orange, a small independent principality in the south of France, having inherited the title from his father, also named William, who died of smallpox 8 days before his birth. It was a tough time for his mother Mary. Not only had she just lost her husband, but almost 2 years earlier her father, King Charles I, had been beheaded by his own subjects. William's mother was a distant figure in his life, spending most of his early years out of the country, promoting the interests of her brother Charles and James before dying of the same disease that claimed her husband in 1660. Instead, the young man's upbringing and education was a political football, thrown between various Dutch factions, each with their own purposes in mind. The Dutch Republic in those days was a collection of 7 provinces that nominally owed their allegiance to the States General, but in fact possessed a wide degree of autonomy over their own affairs. Each province selected a stadtholder or steward who served as a chief executive. Stadtholder was not a hereditary position, much like the title of Holy Roman Emperor. The elections were traditionally dominated by a single family, the House of Orange. Therefore, it was expected that one day Prince William would grow up to be a leading figure in Dutch politics, making his early years a matter of national importance. Pro-Republican faction led by Johan de Witt wanted to keep the young prince from concentrating too much executive power in his hands the way his predecessors had done, using political maneuvering to prevent William from being elected stadtholder. But the situation changed dramatically in 1672, remembered in Dutch history as the Rampjaar, the disaster year. English King Charles II concluded a secret treaty with his French counterpart, Louis XIV, to destroy the Dutch Republic, which, though it was small in size, was one of the richest countries in Europe thanks to its worldwide trading empire. France and her allies invaded the Netherlands, quickly overrunning 3 of the Republic's 7 provinces. To halt their advance, the Dutch flooded their waterline, a defensive system of dikes and dams that could be deliberately flooded to turn Holland into an island. Meanwhile, the Dutch government was in chaos as people in cities like Amsterdam rioted, blaming the government for the military disaster. The Orangist faction, meanwhile, took advantage of the situation to ensure their champion, Prince William, was given his due. He was named stadtholder of the key provinces of Holland and Zeeland, as well as named captain general of the Dutch army. His ascendancy was completed when his chief rival, Johan de Witt, was dragged out of his home and lynched along with his brother by an angry mob. For most of his military career, William was at a distinct disadvantage. His armies were almost always smaller and not as well provisioned as their French counterparts. Historians also agree that he was never better than average as a commander, talent-wise, especially when compared to Louis XIV's marshals, considered the best generals in Europe. He made up for these shortcomings with dogged determination, personal courage. He once pledged to die in the last ditch rather than surrender the Republic to her enemies, and skillful diplomacy. After weathering the disasters of 1672, William assembled an anti-French alliance, including the Holy Roman Empire, Spain, and Brandenburg, Prussia, which widened the war to a pan-European affair. William's first objective was to eject the French from the Republic's territory, which he accomplished in November 1673 with the capture of the city of Bonn, cutting the supply lines of the French troops and forcing them to withdraw. This is said to have shocked King Louis so bad that he went into seclusion for a time at his chateau in Saint-Germain, refusing to see anyone except for a few favorites. After knocking France's allies Munster and Colonia out of the war, William focused on recapturing the Spanish Netherlands, today the countries of Belgium and Luxembourg, for the Allies. He also came to terms with his uncle, King Charles, after the English suffered a number of defeats on the high seas to the Dutch navy. The rapprochement between England and the Dutch was signified by the marriage in 1677 between William and his first cousin, 15-year-old Princess Mary. Mary was the daughter of King Charles's brother James, the Duke of York, making her second in line for the throne. The staunchly Catholic James opposed the marriage of his daughter to the Protestant William, but was overruled by the king, who was himself under pressure from Parliament to approve the match. When Mary was first told of the marriage arrangements, she is said to have cried for an entire day. William was 12 years older than her, and his reputation as a cold, brooding, and distant man had preceded him. But any reservations she might have had about the marriage soon vanished. The couple fell deeply in love with each other within a year of being married. The Franco-Dutch War continued until September 1678, when the Treaty of Nijmegen was signed. Though France made some territorial gains in Germany, Louis's chief goal, suzerainty over the Dutch, had not been achieved. Most put the responsibility for that at the feet of Prince William, who gained a reputation as one of the foremost statesmen in Europe, the bulwark of Protestantism, earning the respect even of his enemies. William was happy enough to end the war with France, but he believed it was only a matter of time until Louis's expansionist policies brought them into conflict again. If you're like William III and want to get yourself involved in Dutch politics, you're going to need a professional website to spread the word. And the sponsor for today's video, Squarespace, has you covered. Squarespace is the all-in-one website platform, perfect for entrepreneurs with wares to sell, bloggers with a message to spread, and artists looking to reach the masses with their work. Whether you're just starting out or you're looking for a better way to manage your brand, Squarespace makes it easy for you to create a beautiful, professional website, engage with your audience, and make sure the right people are getting your message. Squarespace's Fluid Engine makes it easier than ever for pretty much anyone to dive in and make a beautiful website. Answer a few questions about the goals you'd like to accomplish with your site, choose a template, and get dragging and dropping elements onto your template. And drag and drop technology like this is included in every Squarespace site. Need SEO and AI tools? With Squarespace's guided design system, Squarespace Blueprint, your website will be fully tailored to your brand or business, and you'll be able to make sure your website hits all those SEO sweet spots, ensuring you reach the right people to grow your audience the way you want. You can also make the checkout process super simple for your customers with flexible payments. Accept credit cards, PayPal, Apple Pay, and in eligible countries, offer your customers the option to buy now and pay later with Afterpay and ClearPay. Are you an educational content creator or a skilled professional looking to teach a new generation your unique skill set? Squarespace also offers the tools you need to design and sell online courses. Start with a layout that fits your brand, upload your videos, and customize everything using Squarespace's next-generation editing technology. Ready to get started? Check out squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/biographics and use promo code biographics to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. For 10 years, William and his wife lived in peace on their estates in Holland. Their marriage was a happy one, though it was childless. After 2 miscarriages early in their relationship, Mary never conceived again. It is believed an illness rendered her incapable of bearing children. William cared little for the kind of debauchery typical of the English court. Unlike his uncles, whose passion for women and wine were legendary, he very rarely got drunk and is only believed to have taken a single mistress, though whether that relationship was physical or platonic is unknown. While things were peaceful in Holland, the tensions outside the country continued to ramp up throughout the 1680s, increasing William's belief that another war with France was imminent. In 1685, Louis XIV revoked the Edict of Nantes, officially ending the policy of toleration towards French Protestants, or Huguenots. Tens of thousands of them fled across the border to the Dutch Republic, as well as to England. Louis also occupied William's Principality of Orange, and never returned it despite protests. It has been a part of France ever since. Meanwhile, across the Channel, King Charles died without an heir in 1685, making William's father-in-law and uncle King James VII and II, because he was the 7th James to be King of Scotland and the 2nd James to be King of England. I know, it's weird. Almost immediately, James began alienating his subjects, almost all of whom were Protestant, with his pro-Catholic policies. The dispute between James and his nobles wasn't just about religion, however. James was in the habit of ruling as an autocrat rather than by consensus, routinely overriding Parliament with royal decrees to advance his own agenda, even if that agenda was opposed by the majority of his subjects. James was a king very much in the mode of his father and grandfather, believing that he had been ordained by God Almighty to rule his kingdoms, and that therefore he had to answer to no mortal man for anything he did. What he didn't seem to realize, however, was that the people of the realm were no longer willing to put up with that style of leadership. It had been this very dispute that had led to the series of civil wars that culminated in Charles I having his head chopped off in 1649. By 1688, things had reached a crisis point. A Prince of Wales had been born, raising the distinct possibility that a Catholic dynasty might rule over the country permanently. James was rapidly appointing Catholics to leading positions in both the government and the Church of England, which, taken with the French persecution of Protestants within their own borders, led many to believe that a Catholic counter-reformation was underway, to force as many people as possible back to the old religion. Many leading figures in England, including nobles and church officials, now looked across the Channel at William and Mary to save them from the Catholic tyrant. In a sign of just how unpopular James had become, 7 of the most eminent men in the country sent William a petition urging him to invade England, alleging that the infant Prince James was an impostor, a warming pan baby, smuggled in by James's supporters in place of the actual stillborn child. Wow. What a conspiracy, right? It is believed by historians that William didn't particularly want to be King of England. He'd been to England a few times before, and he just didn't like it. The unpleasant air of London aggravated his asthma, and he found court life to be pretentious and unpleasant. He also recognized that, regardless of his own differences with James, openly challenging him would be difficult for Mary. She still loved her father, after all. But William knew that, should the war break out with France again, he would need England's resources and manpower if he had any chance of successfully containing French aggression. Particularly important was the Royal Navy, which was formidable on its own, but combined with the Dutch fleet, would be an unchallenged power on the seas. On the other hand, if James allied himself with the French, it would spell trouble for the Dutch, just as it had in 1672. So William began to plan to invade England, after ensuring that French forces were occupied in Germany and therefore would be unable to attack Holland while he was gone. He assembled a force even larger than the famous Spanish Armada from a century earlier, over 200 ships and 40,000 men. He landed at Tarbes on November 5th, 1688, having spent the last month outmaneuvering both bad weather and the English fleet. William made sure that there would be no looting or destruction of property. His troops were well provisioned and had been paid in advance. Even as unpopular as James was, it was shocking how quickly his rule collapsed once the invasion force landed in England. Large numbers of nobles defected to William's side within days, while the common people mostly stayed out of the dispute. Even James's other daughter, Princess Anne, went over to the side of the invader. James apparently wasn't willing to risk a battle to keep his crown, and rather than negotiate with William, he fled the country in December, his few remaining supporters cursing him as a coward. It had taken just 6 weeks for William to take over the entire country, all without firing a shot. No wonder contemporaries call it the Glorious Revolution. A new parliament was convened in January 1689 to decide what to do about the situation. It was eventually decided that since James had abandoned the country, he had vacated the position of king, a position that was now being offered jointly to William and Mary. In order to preserve the natural succession, Mary needed to be crowned, despite the fact that she had no interest in governing herself and in fact wished to defer to her husband. This unusual settlement made the couple the only jointly ruling monarchs in British history, and it also set a precedent. Up until now, it was simply assumed that kings ruled and their subjects obeyed. Now, for the first time, Parliament had chosen who they wanted to be their monarch, a fairly radical notion in a time period when many countries were still ruled by absolute monarchs. For the rest of their lives, William and Mary would be based in England, though both openly admitted they would have preferred to be living on their estates in Holland. William couldn't stand living in Whitehall Palace, much preferring the seclusion of the recently purchased Kensington House, which would eventually grow into Kensington Palace, the official residence of the Prince and Princess of Wales. While Mary was generally popular with the British public, William's popularity, particularly among nobility, quickly deteriorated. Both the Whig and Tory factions in Parliament believed that they deserved places of preferment in William's new government, and when he instead gave positions of authority to men he'd brought with him from Holland, they began to resent him. Part of the problem, of course, was that he was a foreigner. Englishmen of this period were not the most open-minded. William had become king of not only England, but Scotland and Ireland as well. But William never made the trip north to visit Scotland. And as for Ireland, William visited exactly once, at the head of an army. You see, the recently deposed James had fled across the English Channel to France, where he was an honored guest of King Louis XIV. Louis, always happy to make trouble for his enemies, provided James with money and men to launch an invasion to reclaim his kingdom, beginning with Ireland, where he had the most support. This was largely based on religion. Unlike England and Scotland, most of Ireland's residents had remained Catholic. William crossed over to Ireland with a multinational army and met James in battle at the River Boyne, 32 miles north of Dublin. William's elite Dutch Blue Guards distinguished themselves in the fight, which ended with the retreat of James's forces. James fled back to France, never to return to his former realm, while his supporters, known as Jacobites, would continue to agitate for the return of James and his descendants to power well into the next century. By this point, war had broken out on the European continent again, pitting France against a grand alliance orchestrated by William that included his own forces as well as those of the Holy Roman Empire and Spain. William therefore spent most of the early years of his reign campaigning in the Low Countries. Queen Mary, meanwhile, grew increasingly depressed in her husband's absence. She had long resigned herself to childlessness, something she felt like a failure for. Frequently ill, she seemed resigned to an early death, which eventually came just after Christmas 1694, when she caught the dreaded smallpox. She was only 32 years old. William was devastated by the death of his wife. His grief was so great that those around him feared that he would soon follow her into death. The rest of the country followed his example. Mary's funeral at Westminster Abbey was the first to be attended by all the members of Parliament. William never remarried after Mary's death, and he never took another mistress. He went into seclusion every year on the anniversary of her death and very rarely spoke or wrote about her. The pain was simply too great. He also began drinking much more heavily. William's popularity plummeted after his wife's death. He became an increasingly distant figure to his subjects, spending as much time as possible out of the country. Even after peace with Louis XIV was concluded in 1697. An economic crisis caused by the war certainly didn't help his polling numbers either. Meanwhile, William had a distant relationship with his heir, his sister-in-law, Princess Anne, who constantly participated in intrigues against him at court. The end of William's life was dominated by the threat of war with France yet again, this time over the issue of who should inherit the Spanish throne. King Charles II had been in poor health for the entirety of his reign and, like William, was childless. When he died in 1700, both the Austrian Habsburgs and the French Bourbons believed they were the rightful heirs to the crown. When Philip of Anjou, the grandson of Louis XIV and his heir, was named King of Spain, the possibility of a superstate that would permanently disrupt the balance of power in Europe was too much for France's enemies to bear, triggering the War of the Spanish Succession in 1701. By this point, however, William, who had been one of the last European monarchs to personally command his armies in the field, was in no fit state to go to war again. He'd been in declining health for years, and in 1702 the king broke his collarbone after a fall from his horse. Initially, the injury didn't appear to be life-threatening, but infection set in, and William died of pneumonia on March 8, 1702, at the age of 51. He was buried in Westminster Abbey alongside the body of his wife. The War of the Spanish Succession continued under the reign of William's successor, Queen Anne, finally ending in 1714 with the Treaty of Utrecht, which was essentially a compromise. Philip of Anjou was confirmed as King of Spain, but he was excluded from the line of succession to the throne of France, keeping the crown separate. This was a result that William would have been satisfied with, as he had spent his entire adult life fighting to contain the rising power of France. It is what guided almost everything he did, including invading England and deposing his uncle and father-in-law. The mission changed the course of British and European history. Parliament would grow in power and influence in Great Britain in the decades after William's death, until the monarchy was largely reduced to a ceremonial role in government affairs. Catholicism would never again be accorded a position of power in the country, except in Ireland, and even today Catholics are not permitted to inherit the British crown. The concept of a European balance of power would dominate foreign policymakers across the continent until the start of World War I, over 2 centuries after his death, and persisted in world affairs even after that, as showcased by the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union in the decades after World War II. All of this can be attributed, at least in part, to the only Dutch king Great Britain has ever had. Well, I certainly hope you enjoyed this video and found it to be as entertaining and informative as I did. If you have, be sure to do all that algorithmic jazz and follow the links in the description and pinned comment. I'm Eric Malachite, and I'll see you next time, Space Cowboy.